DNS Part 1. In this nugget, we start a discussion of DNS, and this will be Part 1. We start off with a discussion of the query process. What happens when a client asks a question and tries to find hostname resolution for a particular host? Well, you'll see that it bounces back and forth much of the time through various different DNS servers, and we'll finally get an answer back to the client. And we'll see the kinds of answers that can come back to the client. It's not always, here's the server and I found it, or here's the host and I found it. Sometimes it's, I can't find it. We also take a look at the various caches that are involved. There's actually two of them, the DNS client cache and the DNS server cache that's also available. We'll also take a look at how to clear those out if necessary. Then we'll take a look at how to actually install DNS and get it going, as well as how to install and configure a primary and a secondary zone. And just in short here, a primary is a read-write copy of a zone, and a secondary is a read-only copy of the zone. And we'll take a look at how these two kinds of zones can have impact depending on zone transfer as well. You might not always want to have a primary or secondary kind of a zone. You might instead want a caching-only kind of a DNS server. I recall that years ago I was working for a fast-growing company and I got promoted to the position of a supervisor after just a few months of employment, and so I was pretty excited, and this is me as the supervisor there. I'll put some hair on myself. Those of you who have seen my picture on the internet know I don't actually have any hair, but this is just my little fantasy, so let me go with it. Anyway, and I also mean my pictures of myself on cbtnuggets.com, not the ones from when I was young and needed the money. Anyway, here we have an employee over here, and I periodically have employees ask me questions. Well, they're first trained to always look in their employee handbook before they ask me a question. So they don't always have to look there. If the employee handbook didn't have an answer to the question, then I would look in my own supervisor's manual, and if it didn't have the answer, then I might have to send the query out or the question out to my own manager. And my manager, most of the time, he was a pretty good delegator, and he's pretty good at deflecting questions. So he would just say, hey, you know what? I'm really too busy to answer you right now, James. So why don't you go ask somebody else from a different department or something? So I'd say, oh, all right, fine, I'll go ask this person. Well, apparently all these people went to the same training school or same college or same seminar because they all knew how to pass off the question and say, go ask somebody else. So I'd go ask another person yet. They'd keep referring me to different people, and I'd be spending all day leaving voicemails and emails to these different people till finally I got somebody who hadn't been to the seminar yet, apparently, and they would give me an answer back. And once they'd give me the answer back, then I would pass it back to this employee. Well, this is a lot like what DNS queries are like. You see, we have DNS clients over here that have a configured DNS server. This would be their supervisor that gives all the answers. And they would send out a recursive query from a DNS client to a DNS server. And the recursive query means I'm going to ask you a question, and the only thing I want to hear back from you is either I don't know or here's the answer. And that's what happens. I don't want you to tell me to go talk to somebody else. That's recursive. That means you give me the answer no matter what. And then on my part, or the DNS server's part, it usually has to perform iterative queries. So it'll perform iterative queries where it just iterative means to repeat something over and over again until the result the result occurs. And I would just ask one person after another, and then this person would tell me someone else to ask. So I'd ask someone else, and they'd tell me someone else to ask, and I'd ask someone else. That's iteration, and that's what happens usually with DNS servers. Well, that whole role of me as the supervisor and answering questions for various employees is much the same as what we have with name resolution and DNS servers in Windows Server 2003, and in most current versions of Windows, by the way. And what happens here is I have an employee out here, or in this case, a DNS client, who's trying to find an answer to something, and their answer is, where in the world is www.west.cbtnuggets.com? Well, they have as configured as their supervisor or as their DNS server, this DNS server that hosts nuggetlab.com. So, what happens when they ask the question? First thing they do is to look in their own client cache, and this can have answers that were previously queried. So, for example, if they were previously able to get an answer to where www.west.cbtnuggets.com was, then that would be in their client cache. And also what we can put in there is the contents of a host file, which is a text file that appears on that client's computer, and it loads into the client cache, which is a small portion of memory, upon startup. And this might be the equivalent of the employee's handbook. So, when the client tries to find www.west.cbtnuggets.com, it looks in the client cache to see if it has the answer. If it doesn't, then it says, you know what, I don't even know what the answer is, so I'm going to go to my configured DNS server, or their supervisor like I was in this case, if you want to correlate it that way, and ask this DNS server if it knows the answer. Well, the DNS server also has a server cache, so that if it has answered this query in the past, maybe for some other client over here, a few minutes ago, if it answered the same query for www.west.cbtnuggets.com, then we'll have it in its cache, and it'll just immediately pass the answer back to this DNS client. if it doesn't have the answer, then it has to find out which manager to go to. How does it know which managers or which other DNS servers to go to? Well, if it's an internet kind of query, then what will happen is it'll load its cache.dns file when this DNS server starts up, and it loads that into a small portion of memory called its server cache. And it will send that query out across the internet, in the worst case scenario, clear up to the root server. And that's really what the cache.dns file does, is it points out where all the root servers are on the internet that we can query. Now, the root server will say, well, you're looking for west.cbtnuggets.com. You're looking in that zone. I don't have that zone. All I know about is .com. So it will send me down to .com. And at this point, although this is a recursive query over on the client's side of things, really, at this point, this is all iterative queries. So all it does is pass back down to me who the .com server is that I can go to. And at this point, the iteration is all on my part, and I have to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth through iteration to find the correct answer. So next thing I know is I ask the .com server where cbtnuggets.com is. The .com server says, well, I know where cbtnuggets.com is, so you can go down here to ask this server. So I ask this server. cbtnuggets.com says, well, I'm not really where you want to be. You want to go one level further. You're looking for west.cbtnuggets.com. So it passes back a referral to west, and I find the DNS server for west.cbtnuggets.com. Then it should have a CNAME or an A record for www.west.cbtnuggets.com, and eventually I can get the query answered and directly contact this server, or actually pass back a referral to this server to this client. And now this client will be able to contact www.cbtnuggets.com. Now, when a client performs a query, it can get one of four types of answers, and the first one would be an authoritative answer. And as I cleaned up my diagram here, that would be, for example, if they were looking for www.nuggetlab.com. Well, this DNS server hosts nuggetlab.com, so it'll have a CNAME record or a host record for www.nuggetlab.com, and it just passes the answer back immediately to this client. Well, because it was able to answer directly out of its own locally configured zone there, that would be considered an authoritative answer that took place. On the other hand, it might just send back a positive answer. Now, a positive answer would be also non-authoritative. And that would be where it had to perform certain referrals for that client. So that was where we had our iterative query, for example, where we were trying to find www.west.cbtnuggets.com. This DNS server had to go iterative queries to all of this, and then finally to this DNS server, which passed the answer back. And then when this DNS server gets the answer and eventually passes that back to this DNS client, well, that's just a positive answer, but it's also non-authoritative because it didn't answer out of its own zones. There's also a referral answer, and a referral answer would be what would happen when our DNS server itself was asking questions. That's what takes place in our iterative queries that we looked at a little bit earlier, because we didn't know the direct connection to west.cbtnuggets.com, so we just got a referral to the root out of our cache.dns. We got a referral to the .com, got a referral from .com to cbtnuggets, got a referral from cbtnuggets to west, and eventually we got the answer back. So those would all be considered referral answers. And then finally, if there was no such host record or CNAME record or any kind of a record for west.cbtnuggets.com, maybe there was no such web server, then when we finally got to west.cbtnuggets.com, then it would send back a negative answer to this Nugget Lab server, which would then pass the negative answer to the DNS client, and that would be our answer, would just be negative. There is no such server, or there is no such resource record for what you're looking for. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a query in action. We'll do that using Microsoft Network Monitor and a remote desktop connection to a Windows XP computer where I have opened www.cbtnuggets.com. Now when I opened up this web page at www.cbtnuggets.com, I'd also been performing a Microsoft Network Monitor packet capture. And here's all the captured packets that we have there, and we see there's 1,300 of them. Well, we don't really want all those packets. All we really want to see here are the DNS packets. So I'm going to click on this little funnel here to edit the display filter. And by default, what you'll see happen here is it's going to enable all packets. And that's what you'll normally see. I had already modified that slightly, so it was a little different when we first looked at this. But that's what you'll see. I'm going to then disable all of them, and then I want to enable only DNS packets. So I'll select DNS and choose enable. And now it's only going to show me packets for DNS, which should give me about 6 packets. 1, 2, 3, 6 packets, yeah. All right, now let's take a look at what actually took place with this packet trace. Here, we started off with the source MAC address of my Windows XP's network card on 10.10.10.32, I think it was, and that was this MAC address destined for this local MAC address. Now, by local, I mean this local server, which is configured at 10.10.10.20. And, of course, it was looking for a standard query for that website. Problem is, this DNS server didn't know the answer. So it just went ahead and looked for, from its local MAC address, it sent out a packet to a destination DNS server. And we'll take a look at what DNS server that was here in a moment. Now, look at this MAC address here. It's the same here, same here, same here, same here. These are actually going to be different servers that it's asking, and yet I'm seeing the same MAC address in all these packets. Why is that? Because that's what's coming back through my firewall. That's the MAC address for my firewall. So that's what we're really seeing there. Now, let's take a look at the query that takes place from the client, first of all, to this local server. If we go on down here, first of all, we'll see that it came from this IP address to this IP address. That's to be expected. We'll also see that it's using UDP, and it's at a destination port of UDP 53. TCP 53 and UDP 53 are used for DNS queries, and so you'll need to keep that in mind in terms of your firewall configuration, because you might want to, for example, close off all outbound UDP 53 queries, so that only specific DNS servers have the ability to make those outbound requests, and you don't have it coming from unknown sources from within your network. Also, you might want to block inbound UDP 53 queries unless you want to allow public internet queries against your configured DNS servers, which will probably be in your DMZ or demilitarized zone, which is a specially configured part of your network for security purposes. Okay, now let's move on further down and take a look at some other things that are going on with this. Again, we're querying for cbtnuggets.com, www.cbtnuggets.com, and it's sending it out as a recursive query. The recursive query from the client will always be a recursive query on Windows clients. They don't really know how to send out iterative queries, and that's the case because unless they have something like a specialized application that specifically sends out iterative queries, they're just not going to do that. Now let's move on further down here as well, and we'll see that in the question section again it's looking for www.cbtnuggets.com. Now this DNS server is going to have to get a little bit of help, so what it does is it also sends out an outbound UDP packet. Again, it's on destination port 53, but this time it's sending it out to 192.42.93.30. And let me just go ahead and open up a command prompt here and do a ping -a 192.42.93.30. Now, why am I doing a -a there? That will do a reverse lookup so that it finds out who this IP address actually is. And we see that the answer comes back as this name. That's one of the top-level domain servers out there on the internet. So that's what it's looking for. It went to a root server to find the answer. Now, the root server came back with an answer for us. Again, if we scroll down to the relevant portion down here, then it came back from port 53 again to this DNS server, and it gave us this. And I had called it a root server. Actually, it's a top-level domain server, which in this case would be the .com top-level domain. And since CBT Nuggets is registered on the internet, it's able to find for us cbtnuggets.com. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got down here in terms of our answer. Here again is our question. Now in terms of our answer, what does it tell us? The authoritative answers for cbtnuggets.com. It gives us 2 records, and one of those records is NS43 is one of the named servers, and the other one would be NS44. If we go further on down, we'll also see that it gives us the IP addresses for both of those servers. There's 43's IP address, and further on down here, there's 44's IP address here. So now what we're going to see is this local DNS server will query one of those DNS servers as well. So let's go on down here to see which one it queried. There it is. Queried the one with the 174 address. I'm pretty sure that was the NS44 DNS server. Now, if we move on further down, we'll see that we were able to get some of the query again, and we were able to, in this case, to also get an answer. And that answer would then come back after we sent out the question, after we sent out the query to this server, the NS44 server. We get an answer back from that same server. And if we scroll further on down here, that www.cbtnuggets.com, and here's our answer section, is on this IP address. And then that's pretty much all we need to know. At this point, now this local DNS server has the answer. www.cbtnuggets.com is on this IP address, and then it will send it back to, recognize this MAC address, remember that's our original XP client. It'll send that answer back to the client. If we move further on down here to the answer section, we'll see that it's sent back. www.cbtnuggets.com is on this IP address. Now also recall that the client cache sometimes gets stale because you might have a record for www.west.cbtnuggets.com, and that's the wrong IP address because that's changed recently, but we still have the old address. We saw in a previous nugget how you can just clear that out by going to ipconfig//flush DNS. However, once it's flushed, if my DNS server still has the old record as well, as soon as I perform another lookup, it is going to get the old record again, and we're still not going to be able to get that website. So what we can do there is to also clear out the server cache. And first of all, let's go ahead and populate our server cache just so we have something to look at and work with. Let's go to cbtnuggets.com, and we've had to use DNS to resolve this through a couple of referrals to get there. Let's also resolve to msn.com, and what's Martha Stewart so happy about here? It drops the charge. Oh, great. I can't even get out of a speeding ticket, and she gets these fraudulent charges dropped against her. Okay, anyway, so we've got some things populated there now. Now, if some of that's wrong, maybe my CBT Nuggets was wrong, then I could go to command prompt, and like I said, ipconfig, since I'm also the client and I'm also the DNS server in this case because this client is the DNS server, then I could do my flush DNS, and then I can also go to, in this case, my DNS server, if it's got stale records, and I can also look up what it's got in there by going to DNS, and you see I've added other servers in the past, which I'm going to refer to a little bit later on. But for the time being, just stay with me here on our DC Nugget 1, which is our current local server. And what I want to do is to look at the cache by clicking on View and clicking on Advanced after having selected DC Nugget 1. And then it shows me my cached lookups down here, and I can go down, oh, there's my .com, there's our CBT Nuggets, it resolved www.cbtnuggets.com to this IP address. And for MSN, it resolved all of these web servers to these IP addresses as well. Okay, so that's how we were able to get all of that. Well, if any of that is stale, what I can do is to right-click on DC Nugget 1 and then choose Clear Cache, or I can go to a command prompt here, and if I've installed the Windows Server 2003 support tools, then I can type DNSCMD, which is a very powerful DNS tool, and then I can do a / clear cache. And that's kind of what I like to do just because I'm at the command line a lot, so I just might as well do it while I'm there. So both methods would then successfully clear out this cache. Now let's go ahead and address how to actually install DNS. Now the DNS server we looked at a moment ago was on DC Nugget 1, which again is my domain controller and DNS server, so it's an Active Directory integrated zone for NuggetLab.com. We'll discuss more about what that means a little bit later on. But for the time being, now let's go ahead and just take a look at how I would install a standard DNS server that I wanted to use as a primary zone, and I wanted to also use a secondary zone on another DNS server. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we would, first of all, install DNS. You could go to Control Panel, go to Add Remove Programs, and this is what most administrators do because we're used to doing this from previous versions of Windows, and then clicking Add Remove Windows Components. Now once you get into this, you'll want to scroll down the list until you find the item that says Networking Services, and then select DNS, and then OK, and then next, finish. Now let me just also point out another way. And this isn't my favorite way. I don't like to use this, but Microsoft seems to have a preference for it in a lot of their documentation. And that is to go to Programs, Administrative Tools, and then go down here to this Manage Your Server item. And you'll notice this and recognize it as being the same interface that appears when you first log on to a server. And you see that down here, I selected that it will not display the page I'll log on. That's why we don't see it anytime we log on to this server. Now what I would do then is to add or remove a role, and then it would just take me through this preliminary steps part of the wizard, which makes sure that everything's plugged in and turned on. After all, you can't detect stuff that isn't there and stuff. So then you just click on Next, and then it's going to tell me what roles are already configured, of which there are none. Otherwise, it would say yes here, and which ones are not. And here it says no DNS server. That's what I want to have installed, so I'll click on Next. And then it says install DNS server, and then also notice that it says run the configure a DNS server wizard to configure DNS. Now, if you used Add Remove Programs to install the DNS server, it would not give you the handy little wizard. After it did install DNS, you could still use the wizard by right-clicking it from within the DNS console. But this just kind of packages the two together immediately for us, so we'll just go ahead and use this as a good example. We'll go ahead and click on Next and let the files install themselves. And this will take a little while, so I'll see you on the other side of this when the wizard starts. And it took less time than I thought, because here it is. And within the wizard, once it starts, you can click DNS Checklist, which takes you to the online help system to look at more information about DNS. But our purposes, we're just going to create a forward lookup zone. And again, a forward lookup zone resolves a name, like www.cbtnuggets.com, to an IP address, like whatever, 10.10.10.5 or whatever the IP address is. You can also do both a forward and reverse lookup zone, which gives you the forward lookup zone I just described as well as a reverse lookup zone, so that I could do something like this, where I would go to a command prompt and type in ping-a, and then 10.10.10.23, and it would return to me an answer out of a reverse lookup zone that IP address belongs to this server. And it uses pointer records to be able to do that. And then we can also do a root hints only, which is also known as a caching only server. And this is what I'm going to do if I don't want any zones on that DNS server. It's just going to cache answers on behalf of my clients. And you might do this if you have a DNS server that is connected to the internet, and all of my internet queries go through that DNS server. Well, if it's got a lot of traffic to the internet, I probably want to be able to cache it only and use it as a root hints only server. Our purpose is we'll use a forward lookup zone only, and then we'll specify some other things. The first one being the server maintains the zone, which would mean that this is a primary forward lookup zone. Or we could say that an ISP maintains the zone, which is not necessarily the truth. It can also be another primary server within our own network, not an ISP, and we're just creating a copy of it on this server. And that would make this then a secondary forward lookup zone. We'll go ahead and say that the server maintains the zone and click on next. Then we'll type in what the name of the zone is going to be, cbtnuggets.com, for example, and then click on next. And then what's going to happen is, since it notices that this server, this DNS server, is not also an Active Directory server, it's not also a domain controller, then it's not possible to store it in an Active Directory zone. So it doesn't give me that option. Otherwise, the interface would have provided me with that. Instead, what it's going to do is it's going to store it in a plain text file called cbtnuggets.com.dns. And it's going to store that in Windows, System32, and DNS is where it stores that. And then every time the DNS service starts, it's going to load the contents of that text file, and you can open this in Notepad. It's going to load that on the DNS server. All right, then let's go ahead and click on Next here, and we specify what kind of updates we want. Again, since we're not part of Active Directory, we cannot do secure dynamic updates because we don't have any means for authenticating anybody using this server because it's only a DNS server, it's not an Active Directory domain controller. We could choose allow both non-secure and secure dynamic updates, however, which has significant security vulnerabilities built into it. You might only use something like that in the case of lab environments or testing environments or something like that, or temporary solutions for troubleshooting. Otherwise, we will just not allow dynamic updates at all for the best security solution in our current situation. Now, if this DNS server does get a query for another zone that it doesn't have any knowledge of, then we could just point it to some other DNS server. It might be, another DNS server within my own organization that has more zones on it, or it might be my ISP or something like that, or I could just leave this blank. You don't have to enter anything in here in order for it to be able to resolve queries for internet hosts on behalf of your clients. You can totally leave this blank, and it'll just go to its root hints file to access internet servers to be able to do internet resolution. But you might enter in IP addresses here for DNS servers within your own network under certain circumstances, and we'll take a look more about that a little bit later on. So we'll just say for the time being, you could say, no, it should not forward queries. And again, it's still going to just use root name servers in the cache.dns file. Then we just click Next and Finish. Well, that's pretty much it. Now we just got to click on Finish here, and we now have ourselves a handy little DNS server interface in the Manage Your Server interface here. We could click on Manage the DNS server, and that would just pop open the DNS console, which you see right here. And then the cbtnuggets.com zone appears here, and I usually open DNS just from administrative tools on the Start menu. You probably will as well. But anyway, let's take a look at what we start off with here. We start off with a Start of Authority record, which identifies a serial number, which is just 1, because that means there's been no changes made to it. If I add some records into this, it'll increment to 2 and 3 and 5 or whatever. And then we have dcnugget3.nuggetlab.com. And then we have the name server itself, which is dcnugget3.nuggetlab.com. Now, one thing that's absent here, which you might have seen in zones of your own, is the actual A record or host record for dcnugget3. And the reason for that is because the primary DNS suffix for dcnugget3 is the same as its domain membership, which is in nuggetlab.com. And you'll identify that again also down here at the end, dcnugget3.nuggetlab.com. So when someone identifies this name server, then they're going to have to find dcnugget3.nuggetlab.com, then they'll probably have to do another query to nuggetlab.com in order to find the actual host record for dcnugget3. And then let's confirm the settings that we have here as shown with the wizard we looked at earlier. We'll right-click here and choose Properties. We see that that's the name of the zone file. It's a primary zone. It can't be integrated into Active Directory, so that's not really an issue, and that's great out there. There are no dynamic updates. All right, now let's go ahead and then delete this zone. And the reason why I'm doing this by right-clicking on the zone and choosing Delete is because I want to show you how to create one from scratch as well using the console. So I'll right-click on Forward Lookup Zones, choose New Zone, start another wizard, which is a little simpler. Then you specify primary, secondary, or stub zone. Again, anything I don't describe right now, we will be describing a little later on. So this is the primary zone. This means that a primary zone, by the way, it means that it's going to be a read-write copy of the zone, whereas a secondary zone is only a read copy, and it simply pulls zone information out of a primary zone. The name of the zone, we'll just do cbtnuggets.com again. CBT Nuggets, I guess I'm going to make that plural, nuggets.com. And then we'll have a zone file of the same name, and we'll not allow dynamic updates, and then finish. And that's pretty much the same thing, just a little bit less hand-holding than in the previous wizard that we looked at. Now then, I've mentioned primary and secondary zones. Let's go ahead and address those a little bit more specifically. These are kind of the root, historically speaking, the root of DNS, which predates Windows products even. They go back into Unix bind servers for years past. And the purpose of the primary zone is to host a read and write copy of the zone. So, for example, here in Phoenix, I've got a headquarters office where I've got a couple hundred salespeople that have laptops that come in and out of the office. And if we allow dynamic updates on this primary zone, then you can imagine there's a lot of changes on that zone throughout the day as people come and go on the network. We also have a 128K WAN link that connects a remote office that's near Interstate 10 in Benson, Arizona, down in southeast Arizona. And we want that location because we have a lot of product that we ship out. It's real close to the highway. It's also real close to Mexico, where we have a lot of products that we're trying to export. And also, it's real close to Tombstone, Arizona, where the gunfight at OK Corral took place, and it's near the Dragoon Mountains, which is where the famous Apache Indian Cochise, who was a contemporary of Geronimo and a co-fighter with the Apache Indian Geronimo, it's near where he is buried in the Dragoon Mountains. At one point in Arizona's past, right before the Civil War, Cochise was accused of kidnapping a 12-year-old red-headed, one-eyed boy. He really didn't, but he was accused of it, and that incited a war with the American Army. Anyway, that did not go well, as you can imagine. Anyway, decades later, in his 60s, he was buried in these mountains by his tribe. He was buried next to his horse and next to his dog, and only the Indians knows where he's actually buried. He's buried in some crevice back in here somewhere, and nobody actually knows where that is. Now, with this read-only copy down here, like I said before, we're getting a lot of zone transfer traffic that takes place across this slow WAN link. And these poor little workstations down here, every time they're trying to get on an internet web page or something like that, right at the same time that they do a zone transfer across this WAN link to the secondary server, then their web pages suddenly stop loading, and they get a big glob of traffic that comes across here. And it's kind of disruptive, and it's not practical for this purpose. Now, why do these workstations even need a NuggetLab.com DNS server? Well, if they're doing registrations as well, then they're going to try to register their host names in the primary NuggetLab.com zone, and so they want to be able to be registered in that zone. Also, in addition to that, they have maybe a mail server up here somewhere, and they may have a file server up here that has small files on it that they need to access from time to time, in addition to their own file servers that they have down here in Benson. Now, if they're really only querying this NuggetLab.com server periodically for the mail server and for the file server up here in Phoenix, well, they don't really need the entire zone down here all the time. In that case, what might be better would be to take out this as a secondary zone, and instead make it a caching-only server. And you see, what we could do then is simply point this server up to this primary NuggetLab.com zone on this DNS server up here. And then it will take the mail server's record, the file server's record, and any of the other records that we have down here. It'll only cache them. That way we only have a few queries and answers taking place back and forth across this WAN link, which will be substantially smaller than doing zone transfers back and forth here all day long. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at how it would create a secondary zone. Now, here I've got DC Nugget 3, and here we've got cbtnuggets.com. And here's the primary zone that I created a little bit earlier. Now, I want to put a secondary copy of that zone on DC Nugget 4, so I'll right-click on DNS up here, by the way, and choose Connect to DNS Server. And this is how I'll often manage multiple DNS servers. This is actually the DNS console on DC Nugget 1. I just open it up, and I just add in additional computers that I want to be able to access. DC Nugget 4 additional DNS servers that I want to access. And then there it is. Now it doesn't have any forward lookup zones on it yet, so I'm going to make it a secondary for cbtnuggets.com. In order to make that happen then, I'll right click here, choose new zone, start a wizard, go to the secondary zone option here, a stub zone of which I'll explain a little bit later on, and then I'll go to secondary zone and hit next, and then I'll enter in the name of the zone. I can type it in, or if I want to, I can browse for it. I know it's on DC Nugget 3 where I double click, it's in the forward lookup zone where I double click, and it's on cbtnuggets.com which I double click and which puts it into the zone name here. Then I'll enter in the IP address of the master DNS servers. Now, the master DNS servers are any other zones that I'm copying this from. We typically thinking of this as being the primary DNS server that holds the zone, that holds the primary DNS zone. In this case, 10.10.10.23. In reality, I could daisy chain this, and I could have a primary server which in turn copies the zone to a secondary server, which in turn copies it to another secondary server. So you could be pulling this from a master DNS server, which is also a secondary DNS server. For our purposes, we'll just pull it from the primary because that's all we have right now. Then we click on Next and Finish, and then there's cbtnuggets.com. Now, as soon as I click on this, I get a big red X. Ooh, that looks like something to panic about. Well, don't worry too much about that quite yet. There's a misconfiguration error right now that we need to fix, and that is that up on cbtnuggets.com, if we go to its properties, then for this primary server, we look at the zone transfers, and it says, well, it's supposed to allow zone transfers. How come it won't? It says allow zone transfers only to servers listed on the Name Servers tab. Well, this is the default setting for Windows Server 2003. If you're accustomed to Windows 2000, then you know that it used to say to any server as the default setting, and that was also a security issue because anybody could configure a DNS server on a laptop, plug into an Ethernet port on my network somewhere in the visitor's lobby or something, and pull down a complete copy of all of my servers and all of my hosts. Well, that was a security issue, so Microsoft changed it to only the servers on the Name Servers tab, of which we don't have any, except for DC Nugget 3. Well, it's not going to do any good to pull traffic to itself, so we need to add another server here. That will be dcnugget4.nuggetlab.com, and I can also resolve that by hitting Resolve here, which automatically puts the IP address in here for me, and then I'll just OK past all this. And now I've got these two name servers. Now they'll both now have name server records in the zone. Now once I've done that, I can go back down here to DC Nugget 4, and then I can transfer from the master by right-clicking on it and choosing Transfer from the Master. Then if I hit refresh, I still see nothing happening here. Well, what's going to happen now? Well, it's just kind of a quirky thing with Windows DNS, but what I'd have to do really, if I want to see this immediately, is to right-click on the DC Nugget 4 item, choose All Tasks, and then choose Restart. Okay. Now, another way you could do that if you were locally seated at DC Nugget 4, and this is a way that I often like to do it, is to just do a net stop DNS, and then a net start DNS. And that's another way of restarting that service. Now when I go to CBT Nuggets down here again and hit refresh, we see that it pulls it all down. Now that looked a little bit cumbersome. In reality, you don't have to worry about that. Just configure the zone. Make sure that it's configured to allow zone transfers to DC Nugget 4. Go to lunch. When you come back, if you still have a problem, there's probably some other configuration or connectivity problem. But in our case, I just restarted everything and manually pulled the zone transfer because I was putting a hurry up on it so that you could go ahead and see it. In this nugget, we discussed DNS, and this was part one of that process. We took a look at the query process that takes place, and I started off with an illustration of how that's kind of similar to a supervisor's role, and where employees ask questions, and the supervisor goes and finds out the answers from multiple managers. Well, that's similar to iterative and recursive queries that take place in DNS servers. And you can get an answer back. It's one of 4 types of answers. It might be an authoritative answer where a manager themselves answers, or a DNS server with authority in the zone answers, or it might just be a positive answer where it just says, I heard that the correct answer is, and it gives you back that answer. That would also be a non-authoritative answer. So those are some of the kinds of answers that can come back. And we also took a look at the caches. There's one on the client, there's one on the server, and that sometimes needs to be refreshed or cleared. Then there's also the issue of installation. Pretty easy to do, and I'll take you through how to use a couple of wizards to install DNS as well as a wizard to install the zone. If you don't install a zone during installation, you can install one later, and you can install a primary or secondary zone or any other kind of a zone that you want there. We start off with primary and secondary zones, and we see how that sometimes a secondary zone can really have an impact on network traffic, especially over slow connections. So we took a look at how to make it a caching-only server instead. and we took a look at the impact of those zone transfers as compared to simply answering queries back and forth over the WAN link and caching them on the caching server. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.